I want to show you some examples of ladder stitch closures on 3 different types of fabric. This is like a robe velour or a craft velour, I can't remember which. This is Windsor Ponte, and this is just a cotton woven. And it works well on all kinds of fabrics. It's really pretty easy to do a ladder stitch on a flat, straight seam. This is a closure here, you can see, as is this one. You're gonna machine sew here, then you'd start about here and sew all the way across using the ladder stitch. That's for a right-hander. If you were left-handed, you'd start on this side and go that way. The other place I use the ladder stitch is to close, like for example, a leg opening. And this particular doll has a joint in this bead in this joint, so it would have been really awkward to try to sew that shut. So I started down here a little ways. Still kind of visible, but better than, say, a whip stitch. This is another way. This is a trapunto style face sewn onto a head using a ladder stitch all the way around. And I usually go around twice on this one to kind of refine as I go. And then a ladder stitch on a curved surface or a curved seam is a little trickier. It just makes for a nice, neat result. And I've done that both on the thigh and on the shoulder. There's one right there. Alright, well, let's give this a try. This is a basic body. It's a 4-piece body, but this could easily be a 2-piece body, front and back. There are a couple of things that would help guide you in keeping your stitches straight and aligned so you don't end up with a wonky seam. First of all, this is a 4-piece body, so there's a seam here and a seam right here. And you know those will have to align when you're doing this closure. The other thing you're going to want to do is make sure that all the raw edges are not tucked under. So I usually use the head of a needle and just pull them all out. I think these are all pretty good. And if you're new to the ladder stitch, make it easier on yourself by marking where the seam allowance is. And this is based on the seam allowance that you used here in these side seams. It'll make for the nicest closure. This is just an air-soluble pen, but you could use a water-soluble too. And I usually sew front to backs together with an 1/8 inch seam allowance, so that's about an 1/8 inch. Now I'm right-handed, so I'm going to start on this end and ladder stitch to close over to this side. If you were left-handed, you'd do the opposite. So I'm just going to insert the needle about an 1/8 of an inch from the edge there, from where my sewn edge stops. Take a small stitch, like a 1/16 or an 1/8 inch, along your drawn line. And you're going to cross over to the other side, about an 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch. If you're working on a small doll, you're going to take very small stitches. The threads crossing the opening are going to be parallel, just like rungs of a ladder. If they start getting wonky, kind of diagonal, then your closure isn't going to be quite as neat. So we've come out this side, go back on this side about an 1/8 of an inch, and then just keep crossing back and forth. Now after you've sewn like that for a distance, it could be a 1/2 inch more or less, you could use a hemostat, but I like to use the eye part of a big needle and just press everything in and kind of pinch as you go to close that seam. And then pull on the thread, not on the needle because the threads will tend to break. And now that is closed. You kind of hold it secure there with your thumb and continue on. So you're going to want that center seam and that center seam to match. So it kind of gives you a guide where you want them to match up. So keep going. That one's too small. Again, grab your needle or hemostat or whatever you're using, tuck everything in, pinch it, and then pull on that thread. So now this is closed to the center seam. Trying to keep those stitches as parallel as possible. I've got some poofy stuffing right here, so I'm going to tuck that all back in. Pinch. About to the end, so I'm going to push all those in again, squeeze, and that looks pretty flat. And then take a couple small knots here. And then stick the needle in right by your knot and come out somewhere else. Put a little bit of tension on the thread and then snip, and those ends will disappear right inside. So now I want to show you a closure on a curved seam, and this one happens to be a cotton woven, which can be a little bit trickier. One thing you'll want to do with a cotton woven, especially if it's a somewhat looser weave, is to make your seam allowance where the opening is a little bit wider than what you might have trimmed the rest of the part to be. Another thing you can do is to put like fray check or some other product like that right along the raw edge, and that'll help it from fraying as you stuff. And because this is a curved seam, it's a little bit harder to gauge where your stitches need to be. So you can draw right along the seam line with your air-soluble pen. You might have to hold this up against a window and use natural light, or use a light box to find where that other line is. And these lines should just be a continuation of the seam you sewed with the machine. Another thing that will help you as you're closing a curved seam is to put a couple of marks on each side that align with each other, so you'll have a gauge. on that torso you saw that I used the center seams. This doesn't have one, so I could use these as guides. Now that I've stuffed this piece, I'm ready to close it. Use your tool to push the stuffing in, and again with doubled thread knotted, you're going to come out right by the end of your machine sewn seam, near that line that you drew. You're going to have to push the stuffing in as you go. I'll probably use smaller stitches on this because it's a smaller part. I'm going to use the head of a needle and push everything inside and pinch it again. I haven't gone quite as far this time. Almost done. Again, take a couple of tiny knots. maybe just one in this case because it's so small and not under a lot of tension. And then bury those ends.